Hello, and welcome to the From Nature to Nurture podcast. I am your host, Danielle, and I'm here today with our 26th episode. Right from the top, I want us all to take a really deep breath because this episode is very important to me and to many other herbalists, and I want to give this the breath and space that it needs. So, deep inhale and deep exhale. So, today we are talking about an issue that has become more prevalent in modern herbalism and what should be the better path going forwards. I'm going to try really hard not to demonize anyone or be too hard, but it is a really sticky topic, so bear with me. Today we are talking about the lack of reciprocity in herbalism. So, what I mean by that is modern herbalism right now kind of looks like getting a bunch of books, shoving a bunch of information down your throat, signing up for all the newsletters and monographs and all the classes, and this information overload where we are sometimes dismissing the connection piece in herbalism. So, if you have been around for a while in my work, or if this is brand new, this might be new to you, but I talk about building reciprocal relationships with the plants a lot. And the main reason of that is because I went through this earlier stage of shoving all this information down my throat and just trying to learn through the books versus learning from the plants. And this can lead to a really disconnected feeling. Sometimes it can feel very performative, and you're missing that like slowness and relationship that the natural world has to offer. Leah Larabelle speaks about this a lot, and what she likes to say is that this is a new term for bringing back an old way. And that's why this is so heavy on my heart, is because this is how I practice herbalism, and it makes me really sad to see people using the plants and thinking of the plants just as resources instead of the beings that they are. An example that I give of this a lot is that when you meet a brand new person, your first thought when you meet that person isn't, what can they do for me? What can I take from them? How can they help me? You're often thinking about all the things that you like about them and like, oh, we have these things in common and these things that we can connect on and these things we can do together. And that kind of mentality is missing in the wider lens of modern herbalism. Now, the indigenous cultures practice this reciprocal herbalism, and a lot of these like older folkways were a lot more connected to the land than we are in our modern age. I think many of us are drowning in this information but starving for the relationship. Somewhere along the way, herbalism became something that many people felt that they had to master quickly instead of walking slowly and moving in the time of nature. And something that I've noticed within myself is that the further along I get on this plant path, the less interested I am in consuming plants and plant information, and the more interested I am in building the relationship with them. Some of the deepest transformative moments for me have been just sitting next to a rose bush or hugging an American sycamore tree or even just working with the plants in more of a food sense, where I'm just incorporating wild greens into my diet, where I'm not looking to extract and take and own all of these things, but I am working with the plants. And that is what reciprocal herbalism really means to me. Building a relationship and working together. That's why you will often hear I never really use the word use. Like, I don't use yarrow for its antimicrobial benefits. I work with yarrow. That one little shift can be a huge difference in your mindset, but this also ripples out into the rest of the world. Reciprocal herbalism asks us not to just look at what the plants can give to us, but what we can give back to them in return. And that can look like many different ways. So we'll go through a bunch of different examples in this episode today. But I think the goal for me is not to learn everything about every plant. The goal for me is to build a relationship with the plant and find my deep personal allies. There is a saying in herbalism that it's better to know 10 plants intimately than to know a little bit about 50. And for me, this all comes back to that relationship component. I am not really looking at really strict memorization anymore. I'm looking into more like participating with the plants, feeling into the plants. And yes, I still utilize my books and my classes and I still study, but I also take time to get to know the plants more intimately. One way that this can look is by learning about the plants, not for what they can give us. So, looking at how they give to others, right? Looking into, is this a host plant for a certain type of insect? Or what is this plant doing for the soil? How is it giving back to its own community as well? And by having that little mindset switch, like I said, of saying work with instead of use and thinking about the plants as beings instead of commodities, then we start perceiving the world in a whole different way. We're thinking more outside of ourselves and more in a community typed mindset instead of an egocentric mindset. And reciprocity is less about perfectionism and more about attentiveness. You're paying more attention to what's going on outside of yourself, outside of what you need, thinking about what does the land need? What do the other critters in the area need? What does your wider community need? And by changing our definition of community to include plants and animals and insects, that also just has us having a more robust community as well. So I might be quoting Leah Larabelle a lot in this podcast because I was already planning on recording this episode long before the Wild Medicine Conference that I went to in May, but Leah taught a class on this whole topic. So I told her afterwards, I was like, I'm going to be telling you a bunch of quotes because she just really has a great way of putting this into perspective. Um, Something that she said is that a lot of the modern herbalism has kind of changed from pill for an ill to plant for a problem. Now, that is, to break that down, normally we think of like, oh, I have a headache, take an ibuprofen, right? And so when you come to herbalism with that same allopathic mindset, you're looking at, oh, I have a headache, let me take white willow bark. Instead of looking at root causes or other methods outside of the plants, like when was the last time you had some water? When was the last time you ate? Are you sleeping enough? How's your nervous system? Like all these other things that can contribute. And by taking away that pill for an ill, plant for a problem mentality, that just leads us back into a more holistic way of caring for ourselves, but also gets us out of that extractive mindset where we're not just using the plants for our own benefit. If you walk away from this podcast with anything, I want you to come away with this. The land is not a vending machine. It is not there just for us. It is not there just for what we say that we need and just taking and ripping things out of the earth. The land is part of our wider community. And I think that it's so important as herbalists to have that mindset shift because when we care for the land also cares for us. That's part of that reciprocal relationship where you are both mutually benefiting and both caring for each other. In this modern herbalism lens, you can consume endless amounts of herbal content and never truly know a plant until you can see it in the wild, get your hands on it, have a meditation with it, feel it in your body. You don't really know. You think that you know because that's what the books say, but there have been countless examples that I have run across in my own path of people having different experiences with plants because every single body is completely different as well. And so how a plant interacts with you could be different than how a plant interacts with someone else. A good example of that is valerian, right? Some people, valerian is very calming and a sedative. Other people, it gives them energy. It makes them very hyperactive. And you don't know how you react until you try it, until you get hands-on with the plants and really work with it. I think many beginners believe that they just need to memorize hundreds of herbs before they can call themselves herbalists, and I just don't believe that that's true. I think if you work with the land and the plants in a respectful way and truly try to build that relationship, even if it's just with one plant, you are an herbalist. This modern herbalism world where it's tons of information overload, disconnective learning, aesthetic herbalism, trying to make things always look pretty versus what are the actual medicinal qualities going on there. This really intense pressure to memorize everything, this like social media herbalism, this overconsumption of herbs and information that leaves people feeling overwhelmed and inadequate and like they can't do it because it doesn't feel good, right? And that's what we are missing is that relationship. We're missing that slowing down and learning at the pace of nature, getting to know the plants right outside our door before we look at all of the exotic herbs that are growing in different countries. This depth can create far more confidence than quantity of information does. So I want to get into how looking at reciprocity can change you and some different stories of how this has kind of looked like in my life. So it's been a few years since I've started incorporating this more reciprocal relationship with the land, but I've had a lot of interesting little examples pop up that have really helped me kind of solidify that mindset. So a good example of this is my battle with the deer over some of my plants. So if you listened to my interview with Leah Larabelle, I highly recommend that you do, but I told a little bit about the story. But I have planted 5 elderberry plants about 5 years ago. And I didn't put them inside our fence, even though the deer can jump over our fence, but I didn't think it'd be a problem because it was kind of close to the house and honestly, I was just naive. Let's put it that way. Um, and every year the deer have come and demolished my elders. They are right now, they are the tallest they have ever been, and they're about 2 feet tall and 5 years old, so they should be way bigger. But for a while, I tried really hard to battle the deer off. I would watch out the window and I would go out there and start yelling at them and banging things or let my dogs outside. And I tried, like putting little fences around them or all this different stuff to try to keep them to myself. And I was just very, very frustrated. Every year, I have never been able to harvest fresh elderberries because in my area, a lot of them grow along the side of the road, and I'm not going to do that with all the pollution. And I was so excited to be able to work with this plant some more intimately. And ultimately, it became a lesson in reciprocity. This last year, I decided that I am done battling. I look at those plants differently. The elderberries belong to the deer as much as they belong to me, maybe even more so since so much of their homes are being destroyed by building. And so now I still take care of the plants. I still try to keep them healthy, but they are for the deer and the other critters now. And that took 3 years for me to come to that conclusion, and I am still sad about it, and I know that, when I'm supposed to grow them, it'll happen, but my perspective has shifted over time. I am letting them be a part of the wider community. They're not for me, they're not for my products, they're not for my students, they're for my other community. And I plant and tend them knowing that they are feeding the ecosystem and not just myself. I might still sound really sad because I still am kind of upset about it, but that's part of the process, right? I'm looking at it outside of myself. Those plants I planted for me, but they are not meant just for me. And maybe someday they will be big enough. Maybe someday I'll have a different area that I can plant them in. Like I said, right now they're the tallest they've ever been, so maybe this is the year since I've kind of just let them go. But I am not keeping that as like the end all be all. I'm not battling it out with the deer anymore. I used to say every year I'm going to battle. And that's just not true anymore. And I think that is beautiful. I love knowing that the deer are enjoying those plants and that it is nourishing them and making them happy and full. And I have a robust deer community around me. They're constantly coming around or even hopping over the fence and going into my garden, but that's a whole nother story. Um, and actually seeing them around makes me really excited because I know that their homes are being destroyed at a really high rate, specifically in my town. So those are for the deer now, and it is what it is. Another example of this is worms. It sounds so silly to say. But recently, I noticed that I have this shift in my worm feelings. I used to hate worms when I was younger. I thought they were gross, they were creepy. I was just not a fan of them squirming around. And as I've been working more in my gardens and like digging more and planting more and just having my hands in the soil more, I'm constantly touching worms. And now I get really excited every time I see a worm because I know that they are so good for my garden and so good for the soil, especially here because we have so much clay, so it's so compacted. So having the worms in there help to aerate the soil and bring more nourishment to the land. And now I'm the person that is running into the driveway after rainstorms to try to save them before they dry out in the sun. Because I learned this fun worm fact. I used to think that worms were washed out into the driveway during the rain, and I learned recently that that's not true. They take advantage of the rain because the viscosity helps them to be able to basically sprint to a new area. And so when it's raining, they will squirm their way out and they'll basically sprint across the driveway trying to get to the other side or across the pavement or whatever it be, so that they can get to a new area. But if it starts drying out and there's not all of that water to help with the lessen the traction, then that's when they get stuck and then they dry out and they die. And so something that I've noticed that I started doing recently was every time that it starts raining, I'm running out and helping them get across, or once it stops raining, I'm running out and trying to make sure that none of them get stuck up and dried on the driveway because we get a ton. And this kind of sounds like a really small thing, but I think it actually changes how I move through the world. It's reminding me that I'm not the only one here, and it's helping me to look at all of the small beings that we often overlook and don't pay attention to. And once you start seeing life as interconnected, you start to care naturally more. It becomes instinctive. Where now, like the other day, I was going on a date with my husband, walking down the steps after a rain. I'm all like dressed up, and I noticed all the worms. And he's like getting in the car, getting it started, getting ready to go. And I'm over there crawling around trying to move all the worms before we go. And it was instinctual. I didn't even have to like plan on it or go think about it. It was I saw a worm and I immediately hopped into action. Now I know that doesn't really sound like it has to do with herbalism, but it does because it's all about your mindset and how you're moving through the world and your actions. Now, another example of having this reciprocity mindset does strictly fall in the herbalism category, and that is when we are harvesting. So, as I spoke about in the plant communication episode, we're not the only ones that need the plants, right? And sometimes when you're asking a plant if you can harvest, it says no because it is needed, because it is a host plant. A host plant means that plant is either a sole food source or a very strong food source for specific insects, normally caterpillars, butterflies, pollinators, things like that. And so by asking for permission or visually checking to see if there are any caterpillars or butterfly eggs or anything like that, that is how you can care for the land. I've been doing this recently while I've been harvesting um, red clover, and I check the leaves, I check the flowers, and I've noticed I've had these little tiny green caterpillars, and I've missed a few where I brought them back into the house, then I'll see them kind of crawl up the side of the container, and then I'll carry those little caterpillars and put them right back out onto the plants because Reciprocal herbalism has made me realize that I'm not harvesting from an empty landscape. I am participating in a living ecosystem, and these plants are just as important as the insects and are just as important as the deer and are just as important as we are. And you begin to realize how many lives are entwined with the plants that we work with. Another great example of this is with passion flower. Passion flower is a really strong host plant in this area, and it grows robustly, but also because it's a host plant, sometimes it is hard to harvest because you have to check and make sure that there's not eggs on it. Otherwise, you could be destroying a bunch of butterfly eggs. So, by slowing down enough to notice what's going on around you and understanding that we're not the only beings who need the plants, we can really care for our wider community. So, those are just three examples that have really come to light in my life. But I want to talk about some other examples of ways that you can bring forth this reciprocal relationship mindset. So, we already have remembering that you are not the only one who needs the plants, checking for eggs or insects that are physically on the plants before we harvest, asking for permission. This could also look like just studying and learning about what plants in your area are host plants and what is relying on those plants at what time. Again, I know I mentioned her a lot, but Leah shared a really good example of this in her interview with me. So go back and listen to that. But this can also kind of look like planting extra so that that extra can go towards the other beings in your area. Some other actions that you could do would be caring for the land. So, kind of the obvious of like picking up trash, but also removing invasive species, helping to plant more native plants, having a pollinator garden, leaving out water for the birds and the insects, having bird seed out in the winter. Really, anything that is caring for the land without expecting anything in return. That's really the biggest thing. Honestly, I think that if you treat the land and all of its inhabitants just as you would treat your friends and your loved ones, that would make a huge impact on the world, even outside of herbalism. So, this shift from extractive herbalism to reciprocal herbalism has truly changed my life, even outside of my plant path. And I feel more resourced. I feel better about working with the plants. Can see that mirrored in my landscape where I live in a lush, robust area and I'm feeding the deer and I'm feeding the caterpillars, while I'm also being able to feed myself and my family and my community. And because of how deeply this has transformed my life, I did end up creating a program called the Reciprocal Herbalism Program. It starts later this year. It is a 15-week course where we get to know 6 plants intimately and deeply. We will be covering the medicinal qualities of the plants, as well as ecological impacts and folklore and myth, and how plants have played a part in relationship throughout history. I only chose 6 plants because, like I said in the beginning, it's better to know just a few plants intimately than surface level of a ton of plants. And I chose these plants because they have all deeply impacted my life and they also serve a wide range of benefits and different types of stories and legends all tied in there. I didn't want to create a course or something that is just a ton of information and memorization. The whole purpose of this program is based on reciprocity, building that deep connection to the plants, building that relationship, and truly getting to know them on all levels outside of what they can just do for you. What do they do for the world? How can we help them? And learning these 6 plants and these basics of herbalism in this slow, intentional way helps to instill that information in a more integrated way as well. So every other week, we will be meeting live for a few hours so that we can cover a plant deeply and really get to know it. And then in those in between weeks, you'll have integration, more hands-on learning, some different practices, meditations, and learning the basics of herbalism. So like how to make a tincture, how to tea blend, all of those different things. So if this is resonating with you, go to my website, rootandwandercollective.com, for more information. So, to close out this episode, I want to invite you to try to integrate one small act of relationship. Maybe this is noticing what's growing around you. Maybe this is diving more deeply into a plant that you've already started learning about, tending to your land in a new way, or just sitting with a plant and listening. You don't need to know everything to begin building a relationship with the plant world. I think that the earth changes us when we allow ourselves to move slowly enough to be changed, where we slow down and we are not in that loud, fast modern world anymore. Herbalism isn't separate from our daily lives. It can become a way of how we move through the world and how we view our wider community as a whole. One small change can have a ripple effect, so I invite you to try something new and see what happens. If you would like to find out more about my upcoming classes and offerings, you can find me at rootandwandercollective.com. I'll see you along the plant path.